Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to the Epinomis. Epinomis can be translated as sequel to the laws, and indeed, this dialogue presents itself as a continuation of Plato's longest dialogue, the Laws. As such, it shares many characteristics with that work. For example, the Laws and its sequel are the only two dialogues in which Socrates, Plato's teacher, does not appear. They're the only two dialogues that take place outside of the territory of Athens, and hence outside of the scope of the Athenian law. Indeed, they take place away from any city or any city's law. As a result, the first dialogue, the Laws, enjoys a certain radicalness, which appears right from the start of that conversation, when the Athenian stranger asks the Cretan Cleinias whether a god is the source of his city's laws. In the Epinomis, Cleinias has the first word. He asks the stranger to show them how human beings may attain phronesis, prudence, or more loosely, practical wisdom. So, if the Laws begins by asking what is the guiding principle for citizens, the Epinomis begins by asking about the guiding principle for human beings. However, the stranger quickly changes the goal of the inquiry from phronesis to sophia, which we might translate as wisdom, or more loosely, theoretical wisdom. Why this shift? The implication seems to be that you cannot hope to attain practical wisdom if you do not first possess theoretical wisdom. Now, this is, in its own right, a radical position. It contradicts, for example, our modern liberal regimes, which hold that lawful deeds and truthful thoughts may have nothing to do with one another. In contrast, the stranger implies that you can't live right if your thinking's all wrong. Equating phronesis with sophia also means that without being wise, you cannot truly be courageous, moderate, just, or prudent. The popular expressions of those virtues are mere imitations, not the real thing. Finally, true virtue, being wisdom, would belong only to a very few. So if happiness depends on virtue, only a very few human beings could be happy in this life. Everyone else is consigned to more or less misery. The discovery of true wisdom, sophia, then, is of the highest importance. Now, this wisdom is the subject of the rest of the Epinomis, which consists primarily of 3 long speeches by the stranger. In his first long speech, the stranger looks low to the ground. He denies that sophia is farming or hunting or medicine or any other everyday art. He does make a case for counting as the fundamental knowledge, without which we'd be practically mindless. But while this does make sense, counting does not rise to the exalted level of the wisdom thereafter, he says. So, in the second of his main speeches, the stranger aims high. He gives an account of the genesis or coming to be of the gods. He offers lofty insights into soul, the elements, the visible stars, including the planets, and their supposed intelligence. But there's one glaring problem with this high-flying speech. The word wisdom, sophia, is entirely absent from it. The stranger's third and final speech arises from a dispute over whether one should worship these so-called visible gods, the heavenly bodies. The stranger emphasizes that piety is the greatest part of virtue, he says, and he turns piety into astronomy. But true astronomy, he says, does not track the motion of stars. Instead, it builds upon arithmetic and geometry and stereometry to study incommensurability. The stranger calls the person who combines this study with care for the gods most wise and blessed. So the stranger's third speech tries to wrap up things nicely. It tries to unite his first speech on counting with his second speech on the gods. But then, why didn't he just do that to begin with? Why 3 speeches for 1 wisdom? I think a hint appears at the very center of the dialogue, which lies near the center of the stranger's second speech. In making the case that the heavenly bodies are intelligent, the stranger observes that most people argue exactly the opposite, that the regularity of the heavenly body's motion proves that the heavenly bodies are unintelligent. In other words, the multitude takes irregular motion as a sign of choice, hence soul. Freedom, not necessity, is the stamp of intellect. It's an argument that probably sounds familiar to modern ears, but it also raises questions about the stranger's own account. Put simply, he argues that wisdom and piety are the same, the contemplation of the highest, simplest, and most necessary truths. It's a very beautiful vision. But is it true? Are the highest things most necessary? Is the first thing logos, or reason? Or rather, is there a radical freedom, an unspeakable X at the heart of things that inspires fear and worship rather than contemplation? I hope that you can see that the Epinomis, too, enjoys a certain radicalness. Now, the stranger closes the dialogue with one of the few references to law in this sequel to the laws. He says that they will say, and they will publicly decree as a law, that they must summon the nocturnal council, the ruling body of the new city, to this wisdom. With this step, the stranger begins the creation of the city of the laws. In essence, he convenes the council. Or rather, you could say, in the Epinomis, the council has its first meeting. But there is a problem here. In the laws, the stranger had the first word. Cleinias and the Spartan Megillus had the last word. They demanded that the stranger help them found a city. The stranger was silent. Here, in the Epinomis, Cleinias has the first word, and the stranger has the last word with his decree. But we don't hear how Cleinias or Megillus respond. Politics isn't as simple as counting 1, 2, 3, which is why the political things remain central to theory. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to the Epinomis.